Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different. And by diving, I mean literally. We're going beneath the waves to visit places that used to be very much above water, full of people going about their lives, completely unaware that one day their entire civilization would be a topic for a sleep-deprived historian to ramble about at 2 in the morning. So go ahead and dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab some water. Stay hydrated, friends. Tonight, we're exploring the forgotten world beneath the ocean. Cities that were swallowed by time, by water, by geological tantrums, and sometimes just by really bad urban planning combined with rising sea levels. These aren't your dramatic Atlantis-style fantasy kingdoms. These are real places where real people lived, worked, probably complained about their neighbors, and then, whoosh, goodbye forever. We're going to float through centuries of coastal cities that made the fatal mistake of being built at sea level during times when the sea had opinions about where it wanted to be. And spoiler alert, the sea always wins. Always. You can build the biggest walls, the grandest temples, the most impressive harbors, and the ocean will just wait. Patient, inevitable, ready to reclaim everything when the time is right. So, let's begin our journey with a place that was once so important, so wealthy, so absolutely crucial to ancient trade that losing it was like losing the internet. Except, wetter. Heraklion, the city that forgot to stay above water. Heraklion, also called Thunis, because apparently one name wasn't enough. This was Egypt's main port city for centuries before Alexandria showed up and stole all the glory. We're talking about a place that was the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Nile. If you wanted to trade with Egypt, you went through Heraklion. If you wanted to show off your fancy Greek goods, you went through Heraklion. If you were a pharaoh who needed to impress foreign dignitaries, you probably dragged them to Heraklion. This city existed for at least 1,000 years. 1,000 years of people waking up, going to work, paying taxes, worshiping gods, having absolutely no idea that future archaeologists would be finding their stuff under 30 feet of water in Abu Qir Bay. The city was dedicated to Heracles, hence the name, very creative, and it had this massive temple to Amun-Gareb, which was basically the Egyptian-Greek fusion god of choice for a port city trying to please everyone. There were harbors, canals, smaller temples, houses, warehouses full of grain and goods, and probably a lot of paperwork because ancient bureaucracy was very much a thing. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean geologically unfortunate. Heraklion was built on sediment, soft, squishy, water-saturated sediment in the Nile Delta, which is great when you want to dig foundations quickly, less great when earthquakes happen. And earthquakes did happen, because the Mediterranean doesn't care about your architectural ambitions. Somewhere between the 2nd and 8th centuries AD, historians love a good vague time frame, a series of earthquakes and probably a tsunami or two hit the region. The ground liquefied, that's the technical term. The soft sediment basically turned into wet sand and the entire city just sank. Slowly at first, then all at once. Buildings collapsed into the canals, statues toppled into the harbor. The grand temple of Amun-Gareb tilted and slid beneath the waves like a very slow, very wet disaster movie. And then, everyone forgot about it. For over 1,000 years, Heraklion was a myth. Ancient texts mentioned it. Herodotus wrote about it because, of course, he did. Herodotus wrote about everything. But nobody knew where it actually was. It became one of those did-it-even-exist places that scholars argue about at conferences. Until 2000, when French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio and his team were poking around Abu Qir Bay with some fancy sonar equipment and basically stumbled onto the entire city, just sitting there, under the water, waiting. They found colossal statues, red granite columns, gold coins, ships, so many ships, anchors the size of small cars, inscriptions in both Greek and Egyptian hieroglyphics because this was a cosmopolitan place where cultures blended and trade deals were made over wine that probably tasted like vinegar. There were these massive stone slabs with tax decrees carved into them because even in ancient Egypt, the government wanted its cut and wanted everyone to know about it. There were little household items too, oil lamps, pottery, the everyday objects that make you realize these weren't just ancient people, they were people, living lives that probably felt very normal until the ground started shaking. One of the most impressive finds was a stele, a big stone slab that was commissioned by Pharaoh Nektabene I in 380 BC. It laid out rules for taxation at the Temple of Neith in nearby Sais. Very bureaucratic, very detailed, very much the kind of thing that makes modern tax codes look simple. It was discovered perfectly preserved under the water, which is ironic because paper tax documents from last year are probably already falling apart in your filing cabinet. The statues are what really get you, though. There's a 17-foot-tall red granite statue of a pharaoh, probably Ptolemy II, just lying on the ocean floor like a discarded action figure. There's a statue of the god Hapi, the Nile flood god, which is both appropriate and deeply ironic given that this city drowned. There are smaller statues of priests and priestesses, frozen in poses of religious devotion, now covered in algae and surrounded by fish. Frank Gaudio described the discovery as surreal, and honestly, when you look at the photographs and videos of these massive stone monuments sitting in the murky water, surrounded by nothing but sand and the occasional curious fish, it really is. It's like someone hit pause on an entire civilization and then submerged the whole scene in a giant aquarium. The city covered about 11 square kilometers. That's not small, that's a proper urban center. And it's all down there, slowly being excavated by teams of divers who have to deal with poor visibility, strong currents, and the general difficulty of doing archaeology while trying not to drown. What's particularly haunting about Heraklion is how suddenly it seems to have ended. There's evidence of earthquake damage, yes, but also signs that the liquefaction happened relatively quickly. Buildings didn't gradually sink over generations, they collapsed within years, maybe even months. People probably evacuated, hopefully they evacuated, but their entire city, their entire way of life just vanished beneath the Mediterranean. And for over a millennium, nobody knew where it was. Ships sailed over it, fish lived in its temples, sediment covered its streets. The city that once welcomed travelers from across the known world became a secret known only to the water. Pavlo-Petri, Bronze Age suburbia, now under sea. Let's float westward now, over to Greece, where we find Pavlo-Petri, which sounds like it should be a seaside resort, and I guess technically it is now, if you're a fish. Pavlo-Petri is special because it's old, really old. We're talking about 5,000 years old. This isn't some medieval town that got unlucky with a storm surge. This is a Bronze Age settlement that predates most of the ancient Greek cities you've actually heard of. It's older than the classical period, older than Homer, older than the concept of democracy. This place was already ancient when the Parthenon was built. It sits off the southern coast of Laconia, near modern Pavlo-Petri, hence the name, about 12 feet underwater, which doesn't sound that deep, but it's deep enough that nobody really noticed it was there until 1967, when an oceanographer named Folkion Nesteros was surveying the area and realized there were way too many straight lines on the seafloor for it to be natural. Then in 1968, a team from Cambridge University led by Nicholas Fleming did the first proper survey and realized they were looking at an entire town, streets, buildings, courtyards, tombs, a whole urban layout just sitting there beneath the waves, remarkably well preserved because it's been buried in sand for millennia. The city dates back to around 2800 BC, though it was occupied on and off until around 1100 BC when it was finally abandoned. That's nearly 2,000 years of continuous habitation. For context, that's longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire. These weren't primitive villagers huddling in mud huts. This was a sophisticated settlement with urban planning. The streets are arranged in a grid pattern. There are rectangular buildings of various sizes, probably houses, workshops, public buildings. There's evidence of a central courtyard or agora-style space. There are even what appear to be grave sites at the edges of the settlement, because apparently Bronze Age zoning laws also kept the dead separate from the living. What's particularly interesting, and by interesting I mean makes archaeologists very excited, is that Pavlo-Petri appears to have been a trading port. Its location is strategic, right on the trade routes between the Aegean and the Mediterranean. There's evidence of goods from across the Bronze Age world, Pottery shards from Crete, evidence of metalworking. This wasn't some isolated fishing village, this was a hub. But Bronze Age Greece was a complicated time. This was the era of the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the early city-states. Trade was booming, but so were earthquakes, because the Mediterranean sits on tectonic plates that absolutely do not get along. Pavlopetri seems to have been gradually abandoned around 1100 BC, which coincides with the Bronze Age collapse, that fun period when multiple civilizations across the Mediterranean just kind of fell apart. Trade routes collapsed, cities were abandoned, writing systems were forgotten. It was a whole thing. We still don't entirely know what caused it, possibly earthquakes, possibly climate change, possibly invasions, possibly all of the above, because history loves a perfect storm of catastrophes. But Pavlopetri didn't sink during the Bronze Age collapse. It sank later, much later. Probably around 1000 AD, give or take a few centuries, again with the vague timeframes, when earthquakes caused the entire coastline to subside. The land literally dropped. The city that had been gradually covered by sediment suddenly found itself underwater. And there it stayed, preserved by sand and water, untouched by looters because nobody knew it existed. A complete snapshot of Bronze Age urban life, frozen in time. Modern surveys using sonar and underwater photography have mapped the entire site. You can see the street layout. You can identify individual buildings. You can trace the walls and courtyards. It's like looking at an ancient Google Maps, except everything is blue and covered in seaweed. The preservation is remarkable precisely because it sank. If Pavlopetri had remained on land, it would have been built over, plowed under, looted, destroyed. But underwater, protected by sand, it survived. The stones are still there. The layout is still intact. Even pottery fragments remain in place, right where they were left 3,000 years ago. In 2009, a team from the University of Nottingham did an extensive survey and discovered that the site is even larger than previously thought. There are more buildings, more streets, possibly even a second settlement nearby. They used cutting-edge underwater photography and 3D modeling to create a complete digital reconstruction of the city. Which is wild. You can now see what a Bronze Age city looked like in 3 dimensions in detail because it happened to sink beneath the sea instead of being destroyed on land. The tragedy of Pavlopetri isn't dramatic. Nobody died suddenly. The city was already abandoned when it sank. But there's something melancholy about the fact that this place, this important, sophisticated, thriving port that served as a crossroads for Bronze Age trade, is now just a collection of stones beneath 12 feet of water that most people have never heard of. It's a reminder that permanence is an illusion. Cities rise, cities thrive, cities fade, and sometimes cities sink. And then fish swim through their marketplaces for 3,000 years. Dwarka, Krishna's capital, now a diving site. Let's travel east now, all the way to the western coast of India to the Gulf of Kambat, where we find Dwarka, or possibly Dwarka, or possibly the ruins of something that may or may not be Dwarka, which Indian archaeologists are pretty sure is Dwarka, while other archaeologists politely suggest we should be careful about making definitive claims. Welcome to underwater archaeology, where everything is complicated and the debates never end. Dwarka is famous in Hindu tradition as the ancient kingdom of Lord Krishna. According to the Mahabharata and other sacred texts, Krishna established his capital city in Dwarka after leaving Mathura. It was supposed to be a magnificent city, with 70,000 palaces made of gold, silver, and precious stones. The streets were wide and well-planned, the harbor was grand. It was basically the ancient Indian equivalent of a utopian city. And then, according to legend, after Krishna's death, the city was swallowed by the sea in a single day. The ocean rose up and claimed the entire kingdom. Very dramatic, very mythological. The kind of story that makes for great religious texts, but which historians tend to file under probably symbolic. Except there's actually a city underwater off the coast of modern Dwarka in Gujarat. In the 1980s and 1990s, marine archaeologists from India's National Institute of Oceanography started exploring the waters near Dwarka and found extensive underwater structures. Stone walls, building foundations, what appear to be streets, anchors, pottery, artifacts dating back several thousand years. The structures are submerged at various depths, some quite shallow, others deeper, suggesting the area was gradually submerged over time as sea levels rose and possibly as the land subsided due to seismic activity. The Gulf of Combat region is geologically active, so earthquakes and land subsidence are definitely possible explanations. Some of the structures have been carbon dated to around 7,500 BC, which would make them extraordinarily old, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than most of the ancient cities we know about. Other artifacts date to more recent periods, around 1500 BC to 500 BC, which aligns more closely with the traditional dating of Krishna's era according to Hindu chronology, though that's also debated because ancient Indian chronology is complex and contested. Here's where it gets interesting and also controversial. Some archaeologists believe these underwater structures are indeed remnants of the legendary Dwarka. They point to the massive scale of the ruins, the sophisticated construction techniques, the evidence of a planned urban layout. They argue that the mythology preserved the memory of a real city that really did sink beneath the waves. Other archaeologists are more skeptical. They point out that the Gulf of Combat region has been inhabited for thousands of years, and coastal settlements have been rising and falling with sea levels throughout human history. Just because there are underwater ruins near modern Dwarka doesn't necessarily mean they're the Dwarka from Hindu texts. Correlation isn't causation. Ancient texts aren't always literal. And also, 70,000 golden palaces seems like a bit of an exaggeration. The debate continues. More surveys are conducted, more artifacts are found. The Indian government has invested in extensive underwater archaeological research in the area because, let's be honest, if you could definitively prove that a legendary city from Hindu texts actually existed and you found it, that's kind of a big deal. What's not debated is that there absolutely are extensive ancient structures underwater off the coast of Gujarat. Whether they're Krishna's capital or just a series of ordinary coastal settlements that happened to be in the wrong place when sea levels rose is the question. But something was there, something substantial. And now it's beneath the water, slowly being studied by divers who have to navigate strong currents, poor visibility, and the constant challenge of working in a living ocean. The structures include what appear to be protective walls, possibly a harbor fortification. There are foundation stones that suggest large buildings once stood there. The construction technique uses interlocking stones without mortar, which is consistent with ancient Indian architectural practices. There are artifacts including pottery, beads, sculptures, and anchors that suggest this was an active port city engaged in maritime trade. And here's the thing about Dwarka, legendary or not, it represents something important about human memory and the sea. Coastal communities throughout history have watched their cities sink. They've seen harbors submerged, buildings claimed by rising water, entire settlements lost to the waves. And those memories get preserved in stories, in myths, in religious texts that describe divine cities swallowed by the ocean. Maybe Dwarka is exactly where Krishna's capital once stood. Maybe it's a composite memory of several drowned cities. Maybe it's just a coincidence that there are underwater ruins near a place that shares the same name as a legendary city. But the ruins are real. The loss is real. And somewhere in the murky waters of the Gulf of Combat, stone walls that once protected a thriving community now shelter fish and collect sediment. The ocean keeps its secrets. Archaeologists keep diving. And the debate continues, which is probably how it should be. History should be questioned. Evidence should be examined, and sometimes the mystery is more interesting than any definitive answer could be. Port Royal, the wickedest city on Earth, now a fish tank. Let's jump forward a few thousand years and cross the Atlantic to Jamaica, where we encounter Port Royal, which was not ancient, not mythological, and absolutely deserved what happened to it, if you ask the religious people of the late 17th century at least. Port Royal was founded by the English in 1655 when they captured Jamaica from the Spanish, and they immediately realized they'd acquired prime real estate. The harbor was deep, protected, and strategically located on the shipping routes through the Caribbean. It was perfect for legitimate trade, and also perfect for piracy. So naturally, Port Royal became the piracy capital of the Caribbean. We're talking about a city that openly welcomed pirates, privateers, buccaneers, and anyone else who had recently acquired Spanish gold through questionable means. The English colonial government basically gave pirates a base of operations in exchange for not attacking English ships and maybe occasionally harassing the Spanish. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement that involved a lot of rum and very few questions about where all that gold came from. By the 1660s, Port Royal was one of the wealthiest and most densely populated English settlements in the New World. There were about 6,500 people crammed into 50 acres. That's roughly the density of modern London. Everyone lived on top of each other in a chaotic jumble of taverns, brothels, warehouses, and houses that were definitely not up to any kind of building code. The city had a reputation. Contemporary writers called it the wickedest city on earth. There were more drinking establishments per capita than anywhere else in the Caribbean, possibly anywhere else in the world. There were public executions for entertainment, there was gambling, smuggling, prostitution, and probably several other issues that polite society frowned upon. Henry Morgan, the famous privateer, made Port Royal his base. He'd sail off to raid Spanish settlements, come back with holds full of gold and silver, and spend it all in Port Royal's taverns and shops. The economy was basically fueled by stolen goods and questionable morality. The merchants got rich, the pirates got drunk, the prostitutes got paid, and the colonial government collected taxes on all of it while pretending not to notice where the money came from. Religious authorities were appalled. Preachers declared that God would surely punish this den of sin. Port Royal was Sodom and Gomorrah combined, with more rum. Divine retribution was definitely coming. And then it did. On June 7, 1692, at about 11:43 in the morning, a massive earthquake struck. It was probably around magnitude 7.5. The ground shook violently for 3 minutes, which doesn't sound long, but when you're experiencing a major earthquake, 3 minutes is an eternity. Port Royal was built on a sand spit, loose, water-saturated sand, not the most stable foundation even in good times, and these were not good times. The shaking caused the sand to liquefy, there's that word again, and about 2/3 of the city just slid into the harbor. Buildings collapsed, streets opened up, entire city blocks tilted and slid into the water. The earth literally swallowed people. There are accounts of people being buried up to their necks in sand, stuck while water rose around them. One man supposedly sank up to his neck, then was ejected back out by another shock and survived, which sounds like the world's worst amusement park ride. The earthquake triggered a tsunami. Water rushed into the harbor, then rushed back out, taking buildings and people with it. Ships in the harbor were tossed around like toys. Some ended up on top of buildings, some sank, some ended up stranded on land that suddenly wasn't land anymore. About 2,000 people died immediately. Another 3,000 died in the following days and weeks from injuries, disease, and the general chaos of trying to survive after your entire city has collapsed into the sea. That's nearly the entire population. Port Royal was effectively destroyed. The survivors who could leave did. The rest tried to rebuild, but it was never the same. The colonial capital was moved to Kingston. Port Royal remained a small fishing village and naval base, but its days of the wickedest city on earth were over. God, according to the preachers, had spoken, and he had strong opinions about piracy and loose morals. The sunken city remained underwater, slowly being covered by sediment. For centuries, it was just a historical footnote. Then, in the 1950s and 1960s, archaeologists realized that Port Royal was a perfectly preserved snapshot of late 17th century Caribbean life, frozen in time at 11:43 a.m. on June 7, 1692. Edwin Link, an aviation pioneer who got into underwater archaeology because apparently flying wasn't exciting enough, led some of the first expeditions. They found buildings, intact rooms, furniture, bottles of wine, personal possessions left exactly where they fell when the earthquake hit. Later excavations in the 1980s and 1990s recovered thousands of artifacts, clay pipes, pewter plates, glass bottles, medical instruments, navigational equipment, the everyday objects of a thriving 17th century port city. There were even organic materials preserved by the oxygen-poor conditions underwater: seeds, animal bones, wooden structures. One of the most famous finds was a pocket watch that had stopped at 1143. Which is probably not actually true. That story has been embellished over the years, but it captures the moment perfectly. Time stopped for Port Royal on 1143 on a Tuesday morning in June 1692. What makes Port Royal particularly valuable archaeologically is that it sank so suddenly and so completely. There was no gradual abandonment, no time for people to pack up and take their valuables. The city went from fully functioning to underwater in minutes. Everything was left in place. It's like a time capsule, except the capsule is an entire city, and it's underwater and you need scuba gear to access it. Modern archaeology has revealed the street layout, building foundations, even sewage systems. They found evidence of the class structure: wealthy merchant houses near the harbor, poorer dwellings further back, workshops and warehouses interspersed throughout. They found evidence of what people ate, what they drank, what they smoked, what they threw away. And yes, they've found evidence of all that piracy and wickedness. Spanish coins and goods that definitely weren't obtained through legitimate trade. Weapons, gambling tokens, wine bottles in quantities that suggest the rum-soaked reputation was well-deserved. Parts of the sunken city are still being excavated. Other parts are slowly degrading as modern development and tourism impact the harbor. It's a race against time to document and preserve what remains before it's lost forever. Because even underwater, nothing lasts forever. The sea gives and the sea takes away, and eventually the sea dissolves everything into sediment and memory. Port Royal's destruction was seen as divine judgment in its time. Now it's seen as a geological inevitability combined with really poor urban planning. Building a dense city on loose sand in an earthquake zone while ignoring all building standards because you're too busy spending stolen Spanish gold was, in retrospect, not the best decision. But it gave us a perfectly preserved 17th century Caribbean city to study, so, historical silver lining. Or gold lining, considering all that pirate treasure.
Atlit Yam, Neolithic village, surprisingly still there. Let's slow things down now and travel back in time again, way back. We're heading to the Mediterranean coast of Israel, where we find Atlit Yam, a Neolithic village that's been underwater for about 9,000 years. 9,000 years! This isn't a grand city. There's no palace, no temple, no harbor filled with trade goods. This is a small village where maybe 200 people lived during the pre-pottery Neolithic period. They were some of the earliest farmers and permanent settlers in human history. They were figuring out how to stop being nomadic hunter-gatherers and start growing crops and raising animals and staying in one place. And somehow, their village is still there, sitting on the seafloor off the coast of Atlit, about 30 feet underwater. It was discovered in 1984 by marine archaeologist Ehud Galili, who was surveying the coast and noticed stone structures on the seafloor that were way too organized to be natural. When they excavated, they found house foundations, stone-paved courtyards, a semicircular structure that might have been for public gatherings, and a stone-lined well. A well, a Neolithic well, still intact. You can still see the stones carefully arranged in a circle going down into the earth, or in this case, the seafloor. They built a well 9,000 years ago, and it's still there. That's older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than any of the ancient cities we think of as ancient. The preservation is remarkable because the village was quickly covered by sand after it was submerged. The oxygen-poor conditions prevented decay, so we have organic materials that normally wouldn't survive. Wooden tools, plant remains, animal bones, seeds, even human skeletons buried in the Neolithic cemetery on the edge of the village. The skeletons tell their own story. These were not easy lives. Evidence of disease, hard labor, and malnutrition. Several skeletons show signs of tuberculosis, which is one of the earliest known cases of the disease in human remains. Life expectancy was probably around 30 to 35 years if you were lucky. Infant mortality was high. Physical labor was constant. These were the people who were inventing agriculture, domesticating animals, creating permanent settlements, and it was brutal work. But they also had culture. They buried their dead with care. They created art. Stone carvings have been found at the site. They built communal structures, suggesting social organization beyond just family units. They had stone tools that show sophisticated craftsmanship. They weren't primitive. They were our direct ancestors, figuring out how to build a new way of life. The village was abandoned sometime around 7000 BC, probably due to rising sea levels. The Mediterranean was still adjusting after the last ice age. As glaciers melted, sea levels rose globally. Coastal settlements were gradually submerged. The people of Atlit Yam would have noticed the water creeping closer over generations. Eventually, they would have had to move inland, leaving their homes, their well, their cemetery behind. And then, the sea claimed it all. The village that had stood for generations was swallowed by the Mediterranean. The houses collapsed, the well filled with sediment, the cemetery was covered. For 9,000 years, it sat on the seafloor, silent and forgotten, while human civilization marched on above, completely unaware that evidence of their Neolithic ancestors was right there beneath the waves. What's particularly haunting about Atlit Yam is how recognizable it is. Yes, it's 9,000 years old. Yes, these people lived completely different lives than we do. But you can still see the house layouts and imagine families living there. You can see the well and imagine people drawing water. You can see the cemetery and know that these people grieved their dead just like we do. The stone arrangements show planning and cooperation. Someone decided where the well should go. Someone organized the house construction. Someone designated the cemetery location. These were communities with social structures, with leaders, with shared labor and shared goals. And they lost it all to the sea. Not dramatically, not in an earthquake or tsunami, just gradually, inevitably, as the water rose and the coastline changed and the place where they'd built their lives became uninhabitable. They probably tried to adapt, raising foundations, building berms, moving structures further inland, but eventually the sea wins. It always wins. Atlit Yam is still being studied. Divers continue to excavate carefully, documenting every stone, every artifact, every skeleton. They're piecing together how these Neolithic people lived, what they ate, how they organized their society, what killed them, how they buried their dead. It's painstaking work done in difficult conditions, but it's revealing information about a crucial period in human history, the transition from nomadic life to settled agriculture. All because a village sank beneath the Mediterranean and stayed there, perfectly preserved, for 9,000 years.
Baiae, Rome's Las Vegas, now Rome's Atlantis. Let's jump forward to the Roman Empire and visit Baiae, which was basically ancient Rome's version of Las Vegas, if Las Vegas had hot springs and significantly more orgies. Baiae was the resort town where wealthy Romans went to relax, party, and engage in behavior that would make their respectable Roman wives back in the city very unhappy. It was located on the northwestern shore of the Gulf of Naples, and it was famous for its natural hot springs, which the Romans believed had healing properties. But let's be honest, people weren't going to Baiae for their health, they were going to party. Every wealthy Roman who was anyone had a villa in Baiae. Julius Caesar had one, Nero had one. Cicero complained about having to go there because it was too scandalous, which, coming from a Roman senator, says a lot. The poet Propertius wrote warnings about sending your girlfriend to Baiae because she definitely wouldn't stay faithful there. Ovid called it a place that corrupted morals. Even by Roman standards, the same Romans who had professional gladiator fights and public executions, Baiae had a reputation. The town was filled with lavish villas, baths, gardens, porticos, and temples. The architecture was spectacular. Wealthy Romans competed to build the most extravagant properties. There were villas built out over the water on concrete platforms. There were artificial grottos and pools fed by the hot springs. There were mosaics, frescoes, marble columns, statues, and every luxury the Roman Empire could provide. And then it started sinking. The entire region sits on volcanic fields called the Campi Flegrae, the Phlegraean Fields. This is an active volcanic area. Mount Vesuvius is nearby, just to give you an idea of the geological situation. The ground rises and falls due to volcanic activity beneath. It's called bradyseism, gradual uplift or subsidence caused by magma moving around underground. Starting in the 3rd century AD, Baiae began to subside, slowly at first. Buildings near the waterfront were gradually abandoned as seawater encroached. Then more subsidence, more flooding. By the medieval period, much of ancient Baiae was underwater. The rest was abandoned, looted, or built over. For centuries, Baiae was just a minor town with some ruins and stories about how it used to be Rome's playground. Then, in the 1950s, aerial photography revealed extensive structures beneath the clear waters of the Gulf of Naples. In the 1960s, underwater archaeological surveys began, and they discovered an entire Roman resort town perfectly preserved beneath the sea. The underwater site includes villa foundations, street layouts, mosaic floors still intact, statue bases, columns, walls decorated with frescoes. There are remains of the famous baths. There are nymph fans, shrines to water nymphs, with their decorative elements still in place. There are fish ponds from Roman villas, now ironically filled with actual fish rather than the decorative fish the Romans kept at their lavish banquets. One of the most impressive features is the sunken road, an actual Roman road that now runs along the seafloor. You can follow its path underwater, past villa after villa, imagining wealthy Romans and their litters being carried from one party to another, completely unaware that future tourists would be snorkeling above their former promenade. The area has been made into an underwater archaeological park. You can literally snorkel or dive through ancient Roman villas. You can swim through courtyards where Romans once lounged. You can see mosaics that decorated their floors, now covered in algae and visited by fish instead of senators and aristocrats. There's something deeply surreal about diving through Roman ruins. These weren't some primitive ancient culture. These were sophisticated people with engineering skills that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. They built aqueducts, roads, massive public buildings. They had plumbing, heated floors, glass windows. They were civilized in ways that much of medieval Europe wasn't. And their party town is now a scuba diving destination. The preservation is excellent because the subsidence was gradual. Buildings weren't destroyed by earthquakes or tsunamis, they were just slowly, inexorably submerged. The structures remained largely intact, then were sealed by sediment and protected by the water. The lack of oxygen prevented decay. The cool water temperature helped preserve organic materials and decorative elements. Archaeologists have recovered statues, including a famous sculpture group from the Nymphaeum of Emperor Claudius. There are marble busts, pottery, glass vessels, coins, all the material culture of wealthy Roman life, now pulled from the seafloor and displayed in museums. But most of it remains underwater. The site is too large, too complex, and frankly too beautiful to fully excavate. Instead, it's been left as an underwater museum. Divers can explore it, researchers can study it, and the ruins can remain in their watery tombs surrounded by the descendants of fish that Roman aristocrats probably ate at their lavish banquets. The fall of Baiae wasn't due to barbarian invasions or volcanic eruptions, though those things did affect the broader region. It fell because the ground literally dropped out from under it. The same volcanic activity that made the hot springs that made Baiae famous also caused it to sink beneath the waves. There's a lesson there about building your resort town on an active volcanic field, but the Romans were confident in their engineering abilities, and to be fair, those abilities were impressive. They just couldn't engineer themselves out of geological processes that move entire landscapes up and down like a very slow, very wet elevator.
Runholt, the medieval town swallowed by a flood. Now let's head north to the cold, unforgiving waters of the North Sea, where we find Runholt. Or rather, where Runholt used to be, before the sea came for it in what might be the most dramatic single-day city destruction that isn't volcanic. Runholt was a prosperous medieval town on the island of Strand in North Frisia, part of the Duchy of Schleswig. We're talking about the early 14th century, the late Middle Ages, a time when Europe was recovering from plagues, building cathedrals, and generally trying to pretend that the Dark Ages hadn't been quite so dark. Strand was one of the North Frisian islands, and it was wealthy, really wealthy.
The area had rich agricultural land reclaimed from the sea by dikes and drainage, because humans never learn about building below sea level in storm-prone areas. There was extensive trade through the North Sea. Runholt was a major port and market town. It had a church, a harbor, warehouses, merchant houses, and a population of somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people. It also had a reputation for wickedness, because apparently every prosperous port town in history gets accused of being sinful. There are legends about the people of Runholt being arrogant, decadent, and disrespectful to clergy. One story claims that drunk townspeople made a priest give communion to a pig, which seems unlikely, but makes for a good moral tale about divine retribution. On January 16, 1362, a massive storm hit the North Sea coast. This wasn't just any storm. This was the Grota Mandrank, the Great Drowning of Men. It was probably a combination of an extremely low-pressure system, hurricane-force winds, and the spring tide, all hitting at the same time. The storm surge was catastrophic. Waves up to 30 feet high crashed over the dikes that protected the low-lying coastal settlements. Dikes that had taken generations to build were destroyed in hours. The protective barriers failed, and the North Sea, which had been held back by human engineering and constant maintenance, came rushing in. Runholt was obliterated. The entire town was swept away. Buildings were destroyed. Ships were thrown inland. People drowned by the thousands, not just in Runholt, but all along the North Frisian coast. Estimates suggest between 25,000 and 100,000 people died in the Grota Mandrank, though medieval population estimates are always fuzzy and usually exaggerated. The island of Strand was broken up by the storm. Where there had been one large island, there were now multiple smaller islands, Pellworm, Nordstrand, and several others that have since disappeared. Runholt ended up underwater, somewhere in the tidal flats between the surviving island fragments. And then it became a legend. Stories grew about the wealthy, sinful town that God had destroyed for its wickedness. People claimed they could hear church bells ringing underwater during storms, calling the dead to worship. Fishermen reported seeing ruins in the tidal flats during extreme low tides. Runholt became the North Sea's Atlantis, a cautionary tale about hubris and the power of nature. For centuries, it was assumed to be mostly legend, exaggerated by medieval chroniclers who loved a good moral story. But then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers started finding evidence in the Wadden Sea tidal flats. During very low tides, remains of buildings, dike systems, and pottery fragments would appear, then disappear again under the water. In 1921, a storm exposed a large area of ruins. Archaeologists rushed to document them before the next tide covered everything again. They found building foundations, street layouts, remnants of a church, and a medieval well still intact. The well was particularly important because it contained artifacts that had fallen in, pottery, tools, wooden objects, all preserved in the oxygen-poor water and mud. Subsequent excavations and surveys using sonar and core samples have mapped out extensive remains across several square kilometers of the Wadden Sea. There are multiple settlement sites, dike systems, field boundaries, even remnants of a sophisticated drainage system. This wasn't just one town, it was an entire agricultural and commercial landscape that was destroyed and submerged. The Wadden Sea is a challenging place to do archaeology. It's a tidal zone, meaning it's underwater during high tide and partially exposed during low tide. The mud is thick, unstable, and constantly shifting. Everything is wet, cold, and generally unpleasant. Researchers have to time their work to the tides, working quickly during low tide windows, then retreating when the water comes back in. But the preservation is excellent. The anoxic mud has protected wooden structures, organic materials, and artifacts that would never survive on dry land.
They found medieval pottery, wooden tools, parts of ships, leather goods, and even plant remains that show what crops were being grown. What's particularly interesting about Runholt is that it represents a specific moment in time, January 16th, 1362. Unlike cities that gradually declined or were slowly submerged, Runholt was destroyed in a single catastrophic event. The town that existed on January 15th was gone by January 17th. It's a snapshot of medieval life, violently frozen and then preserved by the sea. The story of Runholt is also a story about human hubris and environmental risk. The North Frisian coast had always been vulnerable to storms and flooding. The medieval inhabitants knew this. They built dikes, they maintained drainage systems, they were constantly fighting the sea. But they also kept building more settlements in the reclaimed land, pushing further into marginal, dangerous land, confident that their engineering could hold back the ocean indefinitely. Until it couldn't. The Grota Mandrank wasn't just bad luck. It was an extreme event hitting a population that had overextended itself into marginal, dangerous land. The dike systems were interconnected. When one section failed, the flooding cascaded through the entire network. The people of Runholt and the other destroyed settlements had built a civilization on land borrowed from the sea, and the sea came to collect what humans had borrowed. Modern climate change and rising sea levels make Runholt's story particularly relevant. The Wadden Sea area is still vulnerable to storm surges. Modern dikes are much more sophisticated, but they're still just human engineering holding back natural forces. And as sea levels rise, that engineering has to constantly adapt. The lesson of Runholt, that the sea is patient but ultimately unstoppable, remains true. Today, the ruins of Runholt lie scattered across the tidal flats, visible only during extreme low tides, slowly being eroded by tides and currents. Local stories still mention the church bells that ring underwater. Tourists visit Pellworm and Nordstrand, the surviving remnants of the old island of Strand, and learn about the catastrophic flood that redrew the map of the North Frisian coast. And somewhere under the mud and water of the Wadden Sea, the remains of a prosperous medieval town continue their slow dissolution, reclaimed by the sea that was always waiting to take back what humans had borrowed.
Thonis and the sister cities of the Delta. Let's circle back to Egypt for a moment, because the Nile Delta is basically a graveyard of ancient cities, and we've only talked about Heraklion. The thing about river deltas is that they're geologically unstable, prone to earthquakes, and have this habit of subsiding over time. Also, they flood a lot. Building major cities in a delta is basically asking for trouble, but ancient Egyptians did it anyway because the location was too strategically important not to. Heraklion, which we talked about earlier, had a sister city called Canopus. Same region, same fate, same watery grave. Canopus was famous in the ancient world for its temple to Serapis and its, shall we say, relaxed moral atmosphere. It was basically Egyptian Baye, a place where people went to party, worship in a fairly casual way, and engage in activities that the stricter residents of Alexandria disapproved of. The city was named after Canopus, the pilot of King Menelaus in Greek mythology, who supposedly died in Egypt and was honored with a temple and city. The canopic jars used in Egyptian mummification were named after the city, which was known for its religious festivals and oracle. Like Heraklion, Canopus sank beneath the Mediterranean. Same geological issues, same earthquakes, same liquefied sediment. By the medieval period, both cities were gone, remembered only in ancient texts that later historians assumed were exaggerating or misremembering. When Frank Godio's team was surveying Abu Qir Bay, they found Canopus near Heraklion. More statues, more temples, more evidence of wealthy Egyptian hybrid culture. The cities had been connected by canals, forming a major urban complex at the mouth of the Nile.
Together, they controlled maritime trade between the Mediterranean and Egypt before Alexandria was founded and stole all their thunder. What's fascinating about the Thonis Heracleion and Canopus discoveries is that they rewrote our understanding of pre-Alexandrian Egypt. These weren't minor settlements. These were major cities with sophisticated infrastructure, international trade networks, and cultural significance. And they vanished so completely that modern scholars thought they might be mythical. The artifacts recovered from both cities show the cultural blending that happened in this region. Egyptian religious practices mixed with Greek. The same temples had dedications in both hieroglyphics and Greek. The art styles fused. The trade goods came from across the known world: Greek amphora, Egyptian grain, Syrian timber, African ivory. And then it all sank. The cosmopolitan, thriving port cities that connected Egypt to the Mediterranean world ended up on the seafloor. Their temples collapsed, their harbors silted, their streets buried under sediment and water. Other delta cities met similar fates. Thermois, Menuthis, and various smaller settlements all disappeared into the marshy landscape or beneath the water. The Nile Delta is constantly changing. Channels shift, land subsides, floods deposit new sediment. Over centuries and millennia, entire cities can be covered, moved, or submerged. Modern surveys using satellite imagery, sonar, and underwater archaeology are still discovering lost cities in the Delta region. Every few years, a new announcement emerges about another ancient settlement found beneath the water or buried under meters of Nile sediment. The Egyptian government estimates there are hundreds of significant archaeological sites still undiscovered in the Delta region, many of them underwater or in areas too waterlogged to excavate effectively. The Nile Delta cities represent a specific kind of loss, not dramatic destruction, but gradual disappearance. The ground slowly sank, the water slowly rose. The cities slowly died as their populations moved away and nature reclaimed the architecture. It's a quieter end than Port Royal's earthquake or Rungholt's storm surge, but it's just as final. The sea doesn't care about grand, dramatic gestures. Slow, patient subsidence works just as well. Aulis, the Cretan city that nobody missed. Let's island hop over to Crete and visit Aulis, which was an ancient Greek city-state that existed for about 1,000 years before sinking into the Gulf of Mirabello. And the fascinating thing about Aulis is that it was important enough to mint its own coins, sign treaties with other city-states, and be mentioned by ancient geographers, but also obscure enough that when it sank, nobody really made a fuss about it. Aulis was located near modern Alunda on the northeastern coast of Crete. It was founded around the 7th century BC and thrived for centuries as a modest city-state. It had a harbor, temples, an agora, residential areas, and all the standard features of a Greek polis. It signed a treaty with Rhodes. It minted coins featuring Britomertis, a Cretan goddess. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly respectable, medium-sized Greek city doing perfectly respectable Greek city things. And then, probably around the 2nd or 3rd century AD, it started sinking, or the sea level rose, or both. The archaeological record isn't entirely clear. What is clear is that by late antiquity, much of Aulis was underwater. The city was gradually abandoned, its population moving to higher ground or to other settlements. Today, you can wade into the shallow waters of the Gulf of Mirabello and see the remains of ancient Aulis beneath the clear water. Parts of the ancient harbor works are visible. Foundation walls can be traced. During very low tides, you can walk on ancient streets that are usually underwater. The ruins aren't spectacular. This wasn't Rome or Athens. This was a provincial Greek city that most people outside of Crete had never heard of. But that's what makes it interesting. We tend to focus on the famous cities, the major centers of power and culture. We forget that most ancient people lived in places like Aulis. Perfectly nice, moderately prosperous, completely ordinary towns that happened to be important to the people who lived there, but not important enough for historians to obsess over. Aulis represents all the forgotten cities that sank beneath the waves. Not legendary Atlantis, not scandalous Port Royal, not wealthy Roman resort towns, just regular cities where regular people lived regular lives. And then the water came and nobody wrote epic poems about it.
The site has been partially excavated, but it's not a priority. There's no massive international team, no breathless news reports about amazing discoveries, just local archaeologists occasionally surveying the submerged ruins, documenting what's there, slowly piecing together what life was like in a minor Greek city-state 2,000 years ago. And honestly, that's most of history. Most cities aren't famous, most people aren't in the history books, most lives are ordinary. And when those ordinary places sink beneath the sea, they're mourned by the people who lived there and then gradually forgotten by everyone else. Olis is a reminder that the ocean doesn't care about historical importance. It takes the major cities and the minor ones, the famous and the forgotten, the legendary and the ordinary. The Mediterranean now covers countless settlements that were important to someone once. We found a few of them. Most remain undiscovered, slowly eroding on the seafloor, their stories lost except for perhaps a single mention in an ancient text or a few coins that washed up on a beach centuries ago. The North Sea's drowned coast, Doggerland. Now let's think bigger, much bigger. We've been talking about cities, but what if an entire country sank? Not a kingdom or an empire, but an actual landmass that connected Britain to mainland Europe, supported human populations for thousands of years, and then gradually disappeared beneath the North Sea. Welcome to Doggerland. Doggerland was the low-lying land that connected Britain to continental Europe during the last ice age and for several thousand years afterward. It wasn't a frozen wasteland, it was actually quite temperate, with rivers, lakes, hills, and forests, and it was inhabited. For thousands of years, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived in Doggerland, hunting game, fishing the rivers, gathering plants, completely unaware that they were living on temporary land that would eventually become the seafloor. We know Doggerland existed because of bathymetry, mapping the seafloor. The North Sea is relatively shallow, and when you map it in detail, you can see old river valleys, former coastlines, and landscapes that were clearly above water at some point. Fishing trawlers have been pulling up evidence for years: mammoth bones, stone tools, worked flint, even pieces of ancient trees, all from the bottom of the North Sea. During the last ice age, sea levels were about 120 meters lower than today because so much water was locked up in glaciers. Britain wasn't an island, it was the northwestern edge of Europe. The area that's now the North Sea was dry land, crossed by rivers and inhabited by humans and animals. As the ice age ended and glaciers melted, sea levels rose. Gradually, inexorably, the low-lying areas of Doggerland began to flood. This happened over thousands of years. It wasn't a sudden disaster, it was a slow-motion catastrophe spanning generations. Coastlines moved inland, river valleys became estuaries, hills became islands. People would have gradually moved to higher ground, generation after generation, watching as the landscape of their ancestors disappeared underwater. Around 6200 BC, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that hit the remaining areas of Doggerland. By this point, Doggerland was already reduced to a series of low-lying islands and marshes. The tsunami probably wiped out the last remaining settlements, and then, over the next few centuries, the final remnants disappeared beneath the rising sea. What was once a landscape spanning thousands of square kilometers, home to communities of hunter-gatherers, became the North Sea. An entire country gone. The people who lived there either drowned, migrated, or were assimilated into populations around the new coastlines. Their culture, their knowledge of the landscape, their stories, all lost to the water. Modern research is trying to reconstruct what Doggerland looked like. Using seismic surveys, core samples, and sophisticated computer modeling, researchers have mapped the ancient rivers, coastlines, and topography. They've identified likely settlement locations based on where Mesolithic people typically built camps, near rivers, on elevated ground, in areas with good visibility and access to resources. Some artifacts have been recovered: stone tools, animal bones, plant remains, pulled up by fishing nets or found in core samples. Each tiny fragment helps build a picture of life in Doggerland. These weren't sophisticated civilizations, they were hunter-gatherer bands,
mobile, opportunistic, living in harmony with a landscape that was slowly, imperceptibly changing. But they were there. For thousands of years, humans lived on land that's now dozens of meters underwater. They raised families, told stories, developed technologies, created art, buried their dead. And then the sea rose, and Britain became an island, and Doggerland became a drowned memory that modern science is only now beginning to reconstruct. The loss of Doggerland is a preview of what's coming with modern climate change. As sea levels rise, coastal areas will flood. Not tomorrow, not next year, but gradually, inexorably, the way Doggerland flooded. Populations will move inland. Cities near sea level will require massive engineering projects to survive. Some places will be abandoned. The ocean is patient. It doesn't need to destroy a city in a day like the earthquake that took Port Royal or the storm that destroyed Rungholt. It can take centuries, rising gradually, claiming land inch by inch, generation by generation. And eventually, future archaeologists will be diving through the ruins of our coastal cities, marveling at how we built so extensively at sea level despite knowing what was coming. Because humans never learn. We build on volcanoes, we build on earthquake faults, we build below sea level in flood zones. We build in places that nature clearly marked as temporary, and then we act surprised when nature reclaims them. Doggerland is the ultimate example, an entire inhabited region that became a seafloor. Thousands of square kilometers, thousands of years of human habitation, all underwater. And most people have never even heard of it.
The megacity that might not exist, Kambat. Let's return to controversy and talk about the Gulf of Kambath discoveries that go beyond just Dwarka. In 2001 and 2002, the National Institute of Ocean Technology in India announced that they'd found extensive underwater structures in the Gulf of Kambath using side-scan sonar and sub-bottom profilers. They claimed the structures covered over 9 kilometers and showed evidence of sophisticated urban planning. Streets, buildings, drainage systems, the works. They also announced that some of the artifacts recovered from the site dated to around 7500 BC, which would make this older than the earliest known cities in Mesopotamia, older than anything in the archaeological record that shows sophisticated urban planning. It would completely rewrite our understanding of early civilization. The announcement created a firestorm. Some people were excited, proof of advanced ancient civilizations. Others were deeply skeptical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and sonar images of geometric patterns on a silty seafloor aren't extraordinary evidence. They could be geological formations. They could be modern debris. They could be patterns that human brains are evolutionarily wired to see even in random noise. The controversy continues because the Gulf of Kambath is a terrible place to do underwater archaeology. The water is murky. Visibility is near zero. Strong currents move sediment constantly. The area is heavily used by ships and fishing vessels, and the structures, if they are structures, are buried under meters of silt that shifts with the tides. Some researchers have suggested that what was seen on sonar might be paleochannels, ancient river channels from when sea levels were lower. The geometric patterns could be natural features eroded by water flow. The artifacts that were recovered could have been washed into the area from elsewhere by rivers or currents. Other researchers maintain that the patterns are too regular to be natural and that the artifacts show human modification. They argue that the site deserves more intensive study before dismissing it. The debate is fierce, often emotional, and tangled up with nationalism, religious beliefs about ancient Indian civilization, and fundamental disagreements about archaeological methodology. It's a mess, and it's probably going to remain a mess until someone develops technology that can do clear archaeology in the incredibly hostile environment of the Gulf of Kambat, which might be never. But here's what we can say. There are definitely structures underwater in the Gulf of Kambat. Something created patterns that show up on sonar. Whether those somethings are natural or artificial is genuinely unknown. The dating of the artifacts is contested. The context of the finds is unclear, and until better evidence emerges, the Gulf of Kumbath megacity remains in the category of interesting, controversial, and unresolved, which is honestly where a lot of underwater archaeology lives. The ocean is vast. The seafloor is largely unexplored. Technology is improving but still limited, and every few years, someone announces a new underwater discovery that might be a lost city or might be rocks that happen to look city-shaped. The ocean keeps its secrets. Researchers keep searching, and the debates continue, which is probably healthy for archaeology. Science should be skeptical. Extraordinary claims should be questioned. But also, sometimes extraordinary things are true. We just don't know yet. Conclusions from the deep. So here we are, hours later, having floated through millennia of drowned cities, submerged civilizations, and landscapes that became seafloor. What have we learned? Besides the obvious lesson that building cities at sea level is a gamble with geological timescales. First, that the ocean is patient but inevitable. Whether it takes a day like Port Royal, centuries like Baiae, or millennia like Doggerland, the sea reclaims what humans build along its edges. We can build dikes, walls, harbors, but we're always borrowing space from an ocean that will eventually take it back. Second, that underwater preservation is sometimes better than preservation on land. Cities that remained above ground were looted, built over, destroyed, forgotten. Cities that sank were sealed by sediment, protected by water, frozen in time. We can learn more about Port Royal from its underwater ruins than we could if it had simply been rebuilt. We can see Atlit Yam's Neolithic village exactly as it was abandoned 9,000 years ago because the Mediterranean covered it in sand and kept it safe. Third, that most of history is underwater. We've talked about a handful of sites, but there are thousands more. Every coastline on Earth has submerged settlements. Every river delta has buried and drowned cities. The Mediterranean alone probably has hundreds of significant archaeological sites beneath its waters. The North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the coasts of India and China, the Caribbean, all graveyards of human settlement. Most of those sites will never be excavated. Most will erode away before anyone finds them. Most will remain mysteries, mentioned perhaps in a single ancient text, located only as anomalies on sonar scans, their stories lost to time and tide. Fourth, that humans never learn. We know the sea rises. We know earthquakes hit coastal regions. We know about storm surges and tsunamis and liquefying sediment. And we keep building major cities at sea level. Miami, New Orleans, Venice, Tokyo, Shanghai. Coastal cities housing hundreds of millions of people, all vulnerable to the same processes that took Heraklion, Port Royal, Rungholt, and countless others. We tell ourselves it's different now. We have better engineering. We have predictions and early warning systems. We have flood barriers and emergency protocols. And maybe that's true. Maybe modern technology can hold back the ocean indefinitely. Or maybe future archaeologists will be diving through Times Square and the Thames Barrier and the port of Shanghai, marveling at how we built so extensively in areas that were clearly temporary, completely aware of the risks, confident that it wouldn't happen to us. Fifth, that every lost city was someone's home. We talk about these places as archaeological sites, as historical mysteries, as romantic ruins, but people lived there. They had families, jobs, routines, complaints about their neighbors, hopes for the future. When Port Royal sank, 5,000 people died or lost everything. When Rungholt was destroyed, entire families drowned. When the people of Atlit Yam abandoned their village to rising waters, they left behind their homes, their cemetery, their ancestors. The tragedy isn't just architectural, it's human, and it continues. Coastal communities worldwide are watching sea levels rise, planning evacuations, deciding what to save and what to abandon. The drowned cities of the past are becoming the drowned cities of the present. The Maldives, Pacific Island nations, coastal Bangladesh, Venice.
These aren't historical curiosities, they're ongoing disasters in slow motion. And finally, that silence beneath the waves is absolute. When a city sinks, it doesn't just disappear physically, its sounds vanish. The calls of merchants in the agora, the hymns in the temples, children playing in the streets, the mundane conversations and arguments and laughter of daily life, all replaced by the quiet movement of fish and the slow currents that erode the ruins. That's what the ocean does. It doesn't just take the buildings, it takes the life, the noise, the humanity. It leaves only stone and sediment and artifacts that archaeologists carefully document in waterproof notebooks while their air tanks count down the minutes until they have to surface. The forgotten world beneath the ocean isn't really forgotten, it's just quiet, waiting, slowly dissolving, occasionally revealed by trawler nets or sonar scans or diving archaeologists. A whole parallel history of human civilization, submerged, preserved in fragments, slowly being explored by a species that keeps building in the same vulnerable places despite knowing exactly what happens. We started tonight talking about cities drowned by time and silence deeper than history. And we found that time is patient, that silence is complete, and that history always repeats itself, just underwater this time, where it's harder to see the pattern until it's too late. So, that's our tour of the drowned world. Cities that rose and fell, literally, civilizations that thrived and vanished beneath the waves. And somewhere under the oceans, right now, there are thousands more sites waiting to be discovered, thousands more stories waiting to be told, thousands more reminders that human civilization is temporary and the sea is forever. Now, if you've made it this far, I sincerely hope you're asleep. If not, well, maybe thinking about slow geological processes and the inevitable heat end of all human endeavors will do the trick. Either way, thanks for floating through the drowned world with me tonight. Sleep well, and maybe don't buy beachfront property. Until next time.